When desperation meets delusion, the truth is ripped apart, and we see the empire crumble, and Blake Lively has just handed us the most shocking evidence yet. Not in the form of documents or witnesses, but an Instagram caption, a single line of words, misquoted from a song lyric twisted into the foundation of her entire legal argument. And the world is gasping, because it is so absurd, so reckless, that it feels less like a lawsuit and more like a tragic comedy, when the curtain of perfection is finally pulled back. What we find is not grace, not power, not control, but chaos, desperation, and fear. And that is exactly what is unraveling in front of us right now. Because the name Blake Lively, once attached to elegance and beloved roles, once praised for a golden public image, now sits at the center of a circus so humiliating and so absurd that even seasoned lawyers are shaking their heads, because this is not strategy, this is not law, this is not justice. It is theater, and it is theater of the worst kind, as if someone decided to trade logic for spectacle, to trade dignity for noise, to trade credibility for clownery. And at the very heart of this implosion is a single moment that will echo through every courtroom filing, every headline, every whisper in Hollywood, the moment when her entire legal team, the army meant to shield her from collapse, decided that the strongest weapon they had was not evidence, not witness testimony, not verified records, but a misquoted lyric from an Elton John song, misquoted, stripped out of context, twisted into a supposed argument, and hurled before the world as if it were a sacred scripture. And this is where the tragedy becomes farce, because even those who want to stand by her, even those who once idolized her, cannot keep a straight face at this circus. Because how do you defend the indefensible? How do you argue jurisdiction with a pop lyric? How do you command respect when you turn legal filings into parody? And while this play unfolds on paper, the echoes are everywhere. Headlines mocking her choices, memes ridiculing the argument, lawyers dissecting every word like vultures feasting on a corpse. And the corpse is not just the case, but her credibility itself. Because Blake Lively once sold herself as intelligent, composed, strategic, a woman who could stand beside titans like Ryan Reynolds and hold her own. But now what we see is a house of cards trembling with every breath, one push away from collapse, because Jed Wallace, the judge presiding, has already signaled impatience, already made it clear that this circus will not go unchecked. And that is the fear gripping her team, because judges do not tolerate fools. Judges do not reward theatrics. Judges dismantle facades, brick by brick, until nothing remains. And the moment Jed Wallace strips away the illusions, the world will see what lies beneath. And what lies beneath is panic. And when panic drives a case, every move becomes self-destruction. Every filing becomes ammunition. For the other side, every desperate attempt becomes another nail in the coffin. And so the story grows heavier. The weight grows unbearable, because this is no longer just a case about a book adaptation or a legal technicality. It has become a story of arrogance, of entitlement, of a belief that image could trump truth, and that fame could outweigh fact. And in that belief, Blake Lively has already lost, because when you drag the court into parody, when you transform evidence into mockery, you are not fighting to win, you are fighting to survive. And survival in Hollywood is a cruel game, because it is not the truth that saves you. It is perception. And right now, perception is that Blake Lively has become a joke, a headline to laugh at, a meme, to share a lesson in hubris. And yet the deeper tragedy is that she cannot stop, because once you begin down the road of desperation, once you replace strategy with spectacle, you cannot reverse. You can only accelerate. And so she accelerates, filing after filing, comment after comment, leak after leak, until the walls close in tighter and tighter, and the public who once rooted for her now tunes in, not to cheer, but to watch the crash in real time. Because downfall is addictive. Downfall is mesmerizing. Downfall is the only currency that Hollywood never devalues. And so as she stands before Jed Wallace, her team clutching at lyrics instead of law, her empire trembles. Because this is not a defense. This is a countdown. And when the countdown hits, 0. There will be no applause, only silence. Only laughter. Only the echo of a career that once soared, now plummeting into the abyss. When the cameras flash at the Toronto International Film Festival, when the red carpet is rolled out and the world turns its gaze toward the stars, there is a kind of magic that happens, a magic built on image control, spectacle, and illusion. And no one understands that better than Ryan Reynolds, because while Blake Lively drowns herself in the quicksand of endless legal disasters, he arrives at Toronto, not as a man dragged into chaos, but as a titan, surrounded by power, shielded by charisma. adored by the press and celebrated by fans. Because Ryan Reynolds has mastered what Blake Lively has lost. He has mastered control of perception. He has mastered the art of timing, and while she files laughable legal briefs citing misquoted Elton John lyrics, he smiles for the cameras, embraces his co-stars, and lets the headlines write themselves, headlines that scream about triumph, brilliant strategy, professionalism, and this is the cruel contrast that defines their union. Because when you look at them together, you once believed in harmony in a shared empire, in a couple so untouchable that even whispers of weakness would vanish like smoke. But now those whispers are no longer whispers. They are roars because the empire is cracking. Because as Ryan stands under the lights of Toronto, Blake is buried in court filings, subpoenas, and mockery, and the public cannot ignore it because the split screen is too powerful on one side, glamour, laughter, applause on the other, desperation, confusion, and humiliation. And in Hollywood, perception is reality, and reality is destiny. And that is why this moment matters. Because Ryan's ascent sharpens the blade of her downfall, because the world sees not a united front, but a husband untouchable and a wife unraveling. And this is where it becomes dangerous, because Ryan Reynolds does not need to fight her battles. He does not need to defend her choices. He does not need to risk his empire for her circus. And the silence from his side speaks louder than any defense ever could. It says, I will not sink with you. I will not be dragged into your implosion. I will not trade my credibility for your delusion. And that silence is a dagger that cuts deeper than the loudest criticism. Because when the public sees Ryan moving forward, unshaken, untouched, unfazed, they understand that Blake Lively is isolated. They understand that even within the marriage, she is fighting alone. And in Hollywood, nothing is more damning than isolation, because allies are currency, and without them, you are bankrupt. And as this unfolds, the irony is unbearable, because Blake once believed she could dominate this case with allies. She believed she could marshal her fame, her influence, her network of friends. But look around, where are those friends? Where are those voices? Where is Taylor Swift, the former bestie? Where are the agents who once represented her? Where are the producers, directors, and co-stars who once praised her silence? Silence, silence. The silence is deafening, and it is deliberate. Because in Hollywood, silence is never neutral. Silence is a verdict. Silence says you are not worth saving. Silence says your brand is toxic. Silence says we are moving on. And the cruelest part is that while Blake falls alone, Justin Baldoni and his circle expand their influence. Rebel Wilson draws the headlines. Camille Vasquez sharpens her reputation. Jed Wallace cements his authority, and Ryan Reynolds dominates the screen. And in every headline, in every post, in every whisper, the message repeats. Blake Lively is no longer untouchable. Blake Lively is no longer admired. Blake Lively is no longer in control. She is the spectacle. She is the meme. She is the example of what happens when arrogance meets exposure, and it is this perception that destroys faster than any ruling ever could. Because court decisions are slow, grinding months, years, but public opinion shifts in seconds, and once it shifts, there is no appeal, no motion, no jurisdiction that can reverse it. And now the public opinion is no longer shifting. It is set, it is hardened, it is locked in, and it screams that Ryan Reynolds shines while Blake Lively crumbles. And when history looks back at this saga, when the documentaries are made, when the articles are written, when the podcasts dissect every move, this moment, the Toronto premiere will stand as the symbol, it will stand as the image of contrast. It will stand as the proof that while one half of the empire soared, the other half disintegrated into dust, because perception is power. And Blake Lively has lost both perception and power. And once lost, they do not return, they do not heal, they do not forgive. They only remind you every time you try to rise again that you already fell once, and the world will not forget. And so as the credits roll on the Toronto premiere, as Ryan Reynolds is celebrated as headlines roar his victory, Blake Lively stares at a mountain of paper subpoenas, depositions, amendments, contradictions, and each one heavier than the last, each one louder than the last, each one proof that her empire is not merely wobbling, it is collapsing, and the sound of collapse is not thunder. It is silence. The silence of friends who do not call, the silence of allies who do not speak. The silence of an industry that has already moved on to the next star, the next image, the next story, and she is left alone, clutching misquoted lyrics in a courtroom, begging for relevance, while the world laughs because the world loves nothing more than a fall and the fall of Blake Lively. In Hollywood, every scandal needs a side plot. Every downfall needs an accomplice. Every unraveling needs the sudden entrance of new players. And that is exactly what we are witnessing. Because as Blake Lively clings to her flimsy arguments about misquoted Elton John lyrics, another fire ignites across the ocean, and this one is burning hotter than anyone expected. Rebel Wilson steps onto the battlefield, not with hesitation, not with whispers, but with lawsuits, with receipts, with accusations, against one of the most notorious outlets in the industry, the Daily Mail. And suddenly the scandal is no longer just about Blake Lively and her self-inflicted implosion. It becomes part of a larger narrative of media corruption, public manipulation, and planted stories, and right at the center of this expanding chaos stands James Vituska. The name that keeps appearing, the man who is whispered to be the architect, the dealer. The go-between, the one who places stories like weapons into the hands of publications, desperate for clicks, desperate for scandal, desperate for blood, because Rebel Wilson has accused him directly. She has named him not as a passive observer, but as an active instigator, someone who fed her private information to the Daily Mail, someone who turned her life into content for profit and exposure. And when you trace those threads, when you follow the names, you start to see the same fingerprints on the pieces targeting Justin Baldoni. You see the same style, the same timing, the same manufactured outrage, and suddenly the picture becomes clear. Blake Lively is not merely losing control of her narrative. She is fighting alongside, or perhaps behind, the same figures who are now being dragged into the open by Rebel Wilson. And here is where it becomes devastating. Because Rebel Wilson is not some small voice drowned out by louder celebrities. She is loud herself. She is bold. She is unafraid to take on a tabloid empire in court. She is unafraid to point fingers, to name names, to call corruption for what it is. And when she does, the spotlight does not only fall on her case, it bleeds into everything adjacent, everything connected, and Blake Lively's name cannot escape it. Because if Rebel proves that stories were planted against her by Vituska and his network, then what about the stories against Baldoni? What about the smear pieces claiming he lives like a prince while suffering financial ruin? What about the timing of these narratives surfacing just as Blake's legal case weakens? Can anyone look at that and believe it is coincidence? No. The pattern is too sharp, too deliberate, too synchronized. It reeks of orchestration. And orchestration is exactly what Jed Wallace's lawyers have been hinting at all along. But here is the irony. While Blake claims to be the victim of a smear campaign, she herself benefits from a smear campaign launched at her enemies. Her narrative falls apart under the weight of its hypocrisy. And this is where public perception begins to tilt even harder, because hypocrisy is unforgivable in the court of opinion. You can be ruthless, you can be cunning, you can even be wrong. But if you are caught playing both sides, if you are caught crying victim while secretly sharpening knives against others, you are finished, and this is the cliff edge where Blake now teeters, because the Rebel Wilson case threatens to expose not only the Daily Mail, not only Vituska, but the very machinery of manipulation that Blake may have relied on, and once exposed, it will not be controlled. It will not be spun. It will not be reframed. It will spread through every corner of the internet, every article, every whisper, every headline, and it will say loudly and clearly, Blake Lively is not the hunted. She is the hunter caught in her own trap. Imagine the optics: Rebel Wilson standing in court, presenting evidence, naming names, connecting dots, while Blake Lively's name hovers in the background like a shadow. Because the networks overlap, because the players repeat, because the same hands that planted against Rebel, planted against Baldoni, and who stood to gain from Baldoni's humiliation, who stood to shift public sympathy, who stood to weaken his defense in the eyes of the world, Blake Lively, and suddenly the case transforms. It is no longer a battle about New York jurisdiction, about Instagram captions, about tiny dancer lyrics. It becomes a saga of media corruption, celebrity manipulation, and the dangerous alliances stars form when their carefully crafted images begin to fracture. And while Rebel fights Daily Mail in London, while headlines roar about ethics and corruption, Hollywood insiders watch and whisper, because they know once the machinery is revealed, it cannot be hidden. Again, the veil is ripped, and underneath it is ugly. And that ugliness sticks to everyone involved, especially Blake Lively, because she has already lost the moral high ground. She has already been mocked for desperation. She has already been abandoned by allies, and now she is linked to the ugliest corner of celebrity culture, the corner that buys stories, plants scandals, weaponizes gossip, and calls it news. And here is the real danger. Rebel Wilson has nothing to lose. She has been mocked before. She has been dragged before. She has been doubted before. And she has survived. But Blake Lively has everything to lose. She built her career not just on acting, but on brand partnerships, lifestyle endorsements, the sweet image of America's golden girl turned entrepreneur. And once you are tied to smear merchants, once you are tied to media, corruption brands, flee events, cancel bookings, collapse contracts, vanish, and your value crumbles overnight. And this is why part 3 of this saga is the deadliest. Because it is not confined to a courtroom. It is not confined to a single judge. It is not confined to a legal technicality. It is sprawling. It is global. It is fueled by the fury of another celebrity, who has declared war on the very players Blake may have trusted. And if Rebel wins, Blake loses, even if her name never appears in the official filings, because the narrative will be clear. It will be repeated. It will be locked in. Blake Lively aligned herself with the wrong people, and those people were exposed as liars, manipulators, and profiteers from pain. And once that stain sticks, it cannot be scrubbed away. No hair care launch, no red carpet, no influencer campaign will undo it. Because the internet does not forget, and every future headline will carry the shadow of this era. Blake Lively, once darling of Hollywood, exposed as desperate, entangled with smear merchants, abandoned by friends, mocked by lawyers, and linked forever to the darkest corners of celebrity scandal. And the cruelest part is this. She cannot fight Rebel Wilson. She cannot dismiss Rebel as she tried to dismiss Baldoni. She cannot file against Rebel because the optics would destroy her completely. She cannot attack. Without exposing herself further, she is trapped. She must watch as Rebel swings her sword at the very system Blake once believed would protect her, and she must pray that the blade does not cut too close. But Hollywood does not pray. Hollywood watches. Hollywood whispers. Hollywood chooses sides, and right now the whispers are louder, the sides are clearer, and Blake Lively is losing them all one by one. And so we reach the moment where everything collides, the misquoted lyrics, the flimsy jurisdiction arguments, the planted stories, the hit pieces, the unraveling of public image, the rebellion of allies, the fury of Rebel Wilson, the silence of Taylor, swift the shifting tone of the media, and through it all, one name echoes louder than ever. Blake Lively, once adored, now dissected, once cherished, now doubted, once untouchable, now bleeding in the open. Because what we have witnessed is not just a legal battle. It is the exposure of a pattern, a glimpse behind the glossy facade of celebrity branding into the machinery of manipulation and desperation. And it is a reminder that when power is built on image alone, it is fragile. It can crack. In an instant, it can collapse under the weight of one wrong move, and here the wrong moves pile higher and higher until the tower topples, and everyone can see the truth. And the truth is devastating because Hollywood remembers, it does not forgive. It does not forget. And even if Blake survives the courtroom, even if her team finds some narrow escape from legal humiliation, she cannot escape the stain of hypocrisy, the stain of aligning with smear merchants, the stain of manipulating allies, and turning friends into weapons. And this is the cruel ending. Not of a career perhaps, but of an image once polished, now corroded, an image once radiant, now fractured. And the question that lingers, the question that haunts the audience, the question that will hang in the air long after the cameras turn off is simple. What happens when the star who built her empire on likability loses it all in the court of public opinion? Because sometimes the harshest verdict is not written by a judge, it is written by the people. And that verdict is already echoing louder than any gavel.